Well, hey there. I am Arthur Morris, Birds is Art, and I'm here at Indian Lake Estates in my office with my good dear friend Bob Eastman, who drove down 6 weeks ago from Wisconsin. And it turned out that Bob is the long-lost brother I never knew I had. Anyway, we're having a great time. So today's program is about shutter speed for bird photography. The way I've been teaching for 20 years is that you want to usually shoot wide open, like this one, f4. You want to pick the shutter speed you need to make a sharp picture, in this case 1/4000th, and then adjust the ISO, in this case to 640. And I've been using the thumb dial to adjust exposure for 20 years. It's easier with mirrorless and easiest of all with Sony. But that's your first decision. Pick the shutter speed and then fix the exposure with ISO on the thumb dial. Bob will be offering any comments and questions along the way in case I screw up. So I've been promising this YouTube video for a couple of weeks because I've been trying to get my hands on a good owl image made at 1 second. Now you can see here, 1 second I had to go to f13 at ISO 64. So I could have worked much faster, but I wanted to see if you could do it with the still subject at 1 second. And the big lesson here, of course I was on a tripod, but the big lesson here is you must remember to turn off image stabilization or optical stabilizer with Sony or VR with Nikon when you're doing these 1, 2, 3, 6 second exposures. Because everything was soft. With IS on, I turned it off, bingo, sharp in a second. And the reason for that is, at these long exposures, 1, 2, or 3 seconds, the system will try to sense movement where there is none and shift the lens elements. So we're going to go from slow to fast. So here's a half-second exposure. This is at Bosky when it used to be good. I've always loved this one. Pleasing blurs. And the camera was actually still and the birds just blurred their way across the frame. So you can see the lens, the old 800 5.6, the shutter speed, the aperture, and ISO 100. When you're doing blurs, you want to go low ISO. Hello, pick up the phone, Jim. Well, no bird in this one, but we enjoyed an amazing sunrise at Sebastian when Bob and I were there on November 20th. And the phone keeps ringing. There you go. So the lesson here, even though there's no birds, is when you have this spectacular color and water, you want to experiment with ridiculous slow shutter speeds. And this is handheld, and I loved it. Nickerson Beach, a 13th of a second. I started making blurs at Bosky a long time ago at a 13th, and when I get a good one, I call it Lucky 13. There it is, the luckiest of all 13s. Messing around with the handheld 70-200 with the 2X at a 13th of a second. An oyster catcher in the surf trying to blur the water. And for decades, the classic blur speed has been 1/15th of a second and pan with the animal. And you can see with all these high f-stops that at the time I didn't have any neutral density filters. And I don't have any now for Sony, but I do have, for the front of the 70-200, some 3-stop and 5-stop ND filters. Another one from Nickerson Beach. This one opened a program I did with Denise Ippolito and got huge wows. I still like it. See, a lot of these are shutter priority. There's been a few blog posts recently talking about the advantages of working in shutter priority at dusk and at sunrise. And this is a Brandt's Cormorant in San Diego. 15th of a second plus 1 1/3 stops, probably a little underexposed, but it's much faster and more efficient when you're going to go from slow to fast with relatively consistent backgrounds and lighting. Sometimes you're going to work at a 15th of a second and the object is to make the image sharp. Of course, I'm human. I need to be on a tripod for this burrowing owl in San Diego. And here, a 15th of a second at ISO 4000. That tells you, ladies and gentlemen, it was still dark. So even at ISO 4000, looks beautiful. And I was trying to blur the waves at a 15th. And to get this one sharp, I placed the 300-2.8 with the 1.4 teleconverter flat on the ground with the lens resting on the ground. I shoved it around in the sand and made a sharp one of a young great blackback gull. Typical shutter priority, plus 2.3 stops. ISO 400, the skimmers, Jones Beach, West End Jetty in the background. And the same deal at Fort DeSoto with a mixed flock of shorebirds, surely with a couple of willets, and surely with a dunlin or two, and some sanderlings. Recently, same setup, a wild morning. It was still dark, and the ospreys were going crazy at Sebastian Inlet. Nowhere near enough to make a sharp picture, so I went with a 30th of a second. Now here's one at a 30th, and the birds look fairly well defined. So here's a 30th, and the bird is almost surreal, and here they're almost sharp, and that's a factor of the distance. At a given shutter speed, the closer the bird, the more the degree of blurring. I will call Poolworks back. Anyway, these were at Lower Klamath at the Winter Wings Festival in 2011, 10 years into, what do they call it, digital photography. Sometimes you can get a nice blur, a baby oyster catcher flapping after a bath, and in the next instant, make a fairly sharp picture at the same shutter speed with everything else the same. This one is made at a 40th of a second f10 at a relatively low ISO. I think this is a young red rat snake, and it was in the leaf litter next to my garage, so I laid down on the ground and made the shot. Wanted some extra depth of field. Again, slow shutter speeds. Sometimes images like this can border on the miraculous. It's a 50th of a second in the Pacific Ocean. Don't ask me, I was at f6.3 rather than 5.6. And I was getting slammed in the back by waves, and everything came together to make a sharp picture. Today, I wouldn't hesitate to increase the ISO a lot. Attempting to do blurs, a 60th of a second in manual mode at Sebastian, and lo and behold, the eye came out sharp. This is a JPEG, so I can't. Let's see if we enlarge it. Yeah, pretty sharp on the eye for a 60th of a second. Get rid of the zoom. And now we lost the whole thing. Here I'm at a 60th of a second f9 at 840 millimeters with a young pelican sleeping, going for some extra depth of field, 4 clicks of depth of field. And this one I got very lucky. The bird was still and I was shooting it at a 60th at f14, and when it sort of yawned, I just fired away. And I did some topaz sharpening and a contrast mask to make it acceptably sharp for presentation, but that was a bit of luck. With a completely still bird, this is again the 400-2.8 with the 1.4. I love that combination. hand holding at an 80th of a second at f10. You want to try to get a little extra depth of field when you're close. And Bob must have a sock in his mouth. He got nothing to say. Trying to do blurs at Jacksonville at Huguenot Memorial Park. In 80th of a second, looking for some nice wing blur that I got. But look what happened with the little crab, miraculously sharp at an 80th of a second with the bird flying towards you. Can I explain that? No. If the bird's flying from side to side, your panning rate can help you get a sharp eye. With the bird coming towards you, no explanation.
So Artie, does the situation dictate the shutter speed, or do you go out and experiment all the time?
Well, I like to say that pleasing blurs like these are the mothers of invention. It's pitch dark. I'm at ISO 800 at a 30th of a second. So I'm going to shoot blurs because it's so dark. If you have a 200 to 600 like you do and you want to shoot sharp, you'd have to be at ISO 128,000. So even though the high ISOs are way better than ever, you're still going to lose some fine feather detail at ISO 4,000, 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. And then to go into the 100,000s, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. So sometimes luck, as we've seen on a few, lucky here at an 80th of a second for flight. And this was lucky in reverse. I was trying to make sharp picture of this ruddy turnstone. I loved the clean background. This was over by your little seat in Sebastian. And the bird just shook its head to get after a bath. So one thing I teach, and I'm getting it down after 40 years, is if something unexpected happens, push the shutter button no matter what. You may get something wonderful like this at 1/125th. So now we're in those intermediate shutter speeds, 1/125th on a tripod at 600 millimeters, and you can get them sharp. Notice I'm focusing always on the closest subject. These are red knots in the fall, October 1st, 2020. And here on a tripod at 1200 millimeters, stopping down to f14 to try to get some depth of field. And that was at Sea Houses in the UK. Again, same deal, 200th of a second, f9 on a tripod, getting some extra depth of field. Let's see, yeah. No, this might have actually been with the 200 to 600 in the teleconverter, f9, yes. 200th of a second, the Brandt's cormorant's displaying. I get it nice and sharp on the face, and there's some wing blur. It's vibrating its wings. And Bob will be seeing them with me in San Diego in not too long. And these intermediate speeds, 1/125th, 1/250th, 1/320th, even up to 1/500th, 1/640th, they can be great in the rain or with spray. This one at 1/250th beautifully streaks the raindrops. And here's one on the tripod where I went down to a 2/50th of a second, very early in the morning. And this is already at ISO 3200. And of course, I put the bird on the right side of the frame so I could get lots of the beautiful Spanish moss. And we're going to be heading over to Circle Bar B fairly soon, Bob and I. Mountain bluebird on a setup perch in Colorado. 1/250th of a second at 2500, so we didn't have a lot of light, but at 2/50th, I'm fine making them sharp at 840 millimeters. And 1200 millimeters, bird stays still, 1/250th at f10. And you'll notice even at f10, the eye is razor sharp, and the bill tip is out of focus from lack of depth of field. So when you do stop down with the super telephoto lens, you don't get much. This one I love. I sat on the sidewalk at La Jolla, and there was this wet adult Brandt's cormorant, and I was using the 2:6, so it went down to a 2/50th of a second. Complete zebras on the background, and just love the look of the image, the even light. Colorado again, songbirds on a perch, 840 millimeters, 1/320th of a second. And again, then I'll adjust the exposure till I get some zebras on the highlights. High ISO, 3/20th of a second. This is a sharp-tailed grouse. And thank you, Kevin Heiss, for the great trip. Anita and I went to visit him last year in North Dakota and South Dakota. Using the big lens beanbag at 1200 millimeters, down to a 3/20th of a second. And you could see part of the histogram exposed way to the right. If I pull it out, you'll see all my exposures look like that, but I wanted you to see more pictures while I could still see the stuff up here. About a 4-day-old baby killdeer. 1/320th of a second with a singing bird, you're pushing it. You generally want to get a little bit faster. I was at ISO 1600. Could have gone to a 500th of a second, been a little safer. This poor guy was sitting on the ground in front of a friend's house down by the lake, and he had a big yellow fishing lure in its feet, a swimming plug with treble hooks. So I slowed down to F10 and made a nice head portrait of this osprey. Let's see, 1200 millimeters, so wide open, 400th of a second. The blub is amazing. The trick with using the big lens beanbag, whether you're at 1200 millimeters or 400 or anything, is if you have a lens with a direct manual focus switch, you need to turn it off so you don't throw off focus when you're recomposing. And the same bird, actually this is the week before. 1200 millimeters, again a 400th of a second. Now I've gone a little faster to a 400th of a second. Beautiful early morning light. Greater prairie chicken, this in South Dakota. And tell me what that noise is, Bob. Doot, 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 doot.
It's in his office.
You gotta love it. Today is one of those days where everything is going perfectly. So this was an afternoon. I had a couple with Nikon, and we had the worst afternoon ever at Fort DeSoto. And I said, you just shut the door, thanks. And I said, you want to stop under this derelict bridge and look for birds? And we had two great blue herons threat displaying at each other. Thank you, Bob.
Welcome.
More 1200 millimeters, 500 a second f9, stop down a little. In Cape Coral, the baby burrowing owl. And a 500th of a second with a baby barred owl at Fort DeSoto. Lord, I spent hours there. Notice 6400th of a second, looks great. A Monty Brown picture. Monty's a good student, he listens.
No, 6400 was the ISO, not the shutter speed.
On this one, ISO 6400, yeah, shutter speed 500th.
Okay.
And Monty, I tell him, for 1200 millimeters to be safe, you want to be at a 500th of a second. This is a beautiful Allen's hummingbird on the San Diego IPT last year. And Monty nailed it. Just beautiful. Do a lot of shooting from the car with the blub. Here I'm at F13, stop down 8, 9, 10, 11, 2 1/3 stop, something like that, for some additional depth of field when you're point blank. Got some nice water droplets with this great egret taking off at a 6/40th of a second. The miracle is making it sharp at a 6/40th. Not something I would choose, but again, following that rule that you better follow every time, When unexpected action happens, push the shutter button or you wind up with nothing rather than something fabulous. 2500 ISO, so pretty lucky. 6/40th, 800th of a second. If the bird's moving a little, you can make them razor sharp. You don't need a 2000th or a 2500 for every action, as long as the action is slow. Here I'm hand holding at 1/640th, the ISO 12,800 with the 300-2.8 and the 1.4. This great blackback gull killing a black skimmer chick. Happens most every morning in August, and I'll be going back next year. Now here's another super lucky one, a sharp flight shot at a 6/40th. Could have been at a 12/50th at 3200, but the bird was just sitting there. He took flight towards me. I pushed the button, made it sharp. 800th of a second with the 1200 millimeter. Yeah, let's see. No, this is the 600 alone. So I stopped down 2 stops to cover the whole bird. And some sort of leucistic, young, probably a year or 2 old turkey vulture. The people that run ILE cut this tree down against my protests. And a way back picture, boy, I could have shot at f8. I shot it at f11, a beautiful spoonbill with Captain Froggy, James Shadle at Alafaya Banks. And another one where I was surprised to get it sharp at an 800th of a second with the School of Mullet blasting off. Wow. With the Canon 100 to 400. That was a while back, 2017. More prairie chickens at 1200 millimeters. An 800th of a second is a lot safer than a 200th. 800th of a second, 840, exposing way to the right. And that's wide open at 840 at 5.6. Another oldie but goodie at an 800th of a second, an adult American oyster catcher. I got the whole sequence of him using his laterally flattened bill to cut the adductor muscles of a surf clam. You rarely see a surf clam, a live one, anymore. They've been harvested to extirpation in the Atlantic, Nickerson Beach. 1,000th of a second, why a little fast? For really nothing, there's a lot going on. I'm on a boat, so there's going to be more. The boat's going to be rolling with 5 people on it, and you want to go a little faster. Here I was at 1,000th, could have gone slower. I love this shot. I invited David Pugsley over to take some pictures of the baby cranes, and he came out and it stood at sunrise in the purple flowers. 300-2.8 alone. Spoonbill's grabbing some nesting material. I'm working at 1200 millimeters. You want to be at least at 1,000th of a second. David Pugsley image, 1,000th. Again, 800, 1,000, 12th. Good for intermediate action. As long as nothing's going too fast, no real fast movements. Here I was pushing the limits, hand holding at 1,000th of a second with the 200 to 600, and I needed to get up to 12,800 ISO in order to get to 1,000th of a second. 400-2.8 at 2.8, again under the bridge, same place, on a desperation visit. Juvenile great blue heron, 1,000th of a second. The famous oyster catcher at DeSoto that nested, just about to get on her eggs. And if it's Africa, it must be Anita. And Anita tends to shoot faster than most folks. She doesn't even look at the ISO. So here she was at 1,000th of a second at f9 with the Sony 100 to 400, the 2021 shot, for some extra depth of field, and a shorter focal length of 100 millimeters is going to give you lots of depth of field, and super sharp at 1,000th of a second. I mentioned 12/50th. We've been having some good consistent action. This was in the blog the other day. And I noticed 3200 ISO, F4 wide open with the 70 to 200 and the 1.4. And borderline for very sharp, but borderline from what you'd usually want. More 12/50th of a second for a shorebird. Sandling and breeding plumage in spring at DeSoto. And this is a Jerry George photo. She was with me at Nickerson Beach, and we were doing some skimmers on the ground. And I didn't even see this bird coming. Jerry saw it coming with the 200 to 600 and followed my advice. Pushed a button, you might get it sharp. And she got this wonderful image at ISO 8000 at only 1/12/50th of a second. So while we love a 4000 and a 20 and a 3200 for flight, you can do it slow. Heck, we used to shoot flight with film at a 500th of a second. Mike DeRosa, fair beginner, and both Jerry and Mike are in that class of folks who I say, if you want me to change your life, buy a Sony 200 to 600 and an A1, and let's see what happens. Little Blue Heron at DeSoto by Mike DeRosa. And me using 12/50th of a second, shutter priority, +2. Why so fast? I was hand holding. That's a Gadwall in San Diego. And this is a Judy Stepanaski common tern fledgling begging at Nickerson Beach. And this is proof that I can teach even people with Canon gear and Nikon. Judy was a dead beginner with, I think, an R6 II. And boy, this is from her first afternoon. She just nailed it. Back to me, again, getting a little lucky, a 12/50th of a second, a fledged skimmer in flight, 1200 millimeters. I think I was on my toes, not literally, but figuratively, using the toe pod technique or the foot pod technique to get real low. So you want a little extra shutter speed there. And hand holding at 840, way too close, and come up with a nice, wicked, tight shot of American oyster catcher, trying to get some, what do they call them little suckers? Mole crabs for breakfast for the babies. 1600th of a second now, we can hand hold pretty much with impunity. It's the 300 and the 1.4, a winter ruddy turnstone with the little clam. And another Jerry George image with the 200 to 600 alone. ISO 250 is 1600. So here she could have gone to a higher ISO and got a little more shutter speed or aperture. 70 to 200 at Morro Bay, Birdshit Rock in the background with the 2X teleconverter. 1600th of a second. So here's Kevin Heiss, my good friend, at the 1600th of a second at f4, a Canon 400 millimeter lens with the 1.4 teleconverter. So you go, well, why does he need a 1600th of a second if the bird is sitting on a still log? And look at that beautiful speculum, the blue and the green. The answer was that he's in a floating blind, so he needs extra shutter speed for stability. Another Anita North special, the 400-2.8 with a 1.4, ISO 6400, just to get to 1/1600th of a second, and enough to freeze the action. Alan Goodwin was another one I talked into Sony. At a 2000th of a second, he made this image of a white ibis next to the fishing pier at Fort DeSoto. So I love students who listen to the teacher. I think this is mine. Yep. It's the 400 with the 300 with the 1.4. Royal Turn Chick, double overhead wing stretch. I'm going back to Jacksonville, end of June till July 6th. If you'd like to join us, give me a buzz. And this one qualifies as a miracle at a 2,000th of a second. I was shooting flight with Bob's beloved 200 to 600 with the 1.4 teleconverter at f9 and miraculously got a sharp image of one of the Nande parakeets at Fort DeSoto. 2,000th of a second, 1,200 millimeters on the blub. Enough shutter speed to freeze the eye and a little blur in the wingtip, which I find pleasing. Hand holding the 70-200 with the 2X, trying to get the bird taking flight, so I was at a 2,000th of a second, a little more than I needed for that situation. But a lot of times you want to be prepared for what might happen by having a fast shutter speed. Andrew Schoenbeck is another convert to Sony 200 to 600, complete beginner bird photographer, made this on his first trip using the 2 to 6. Breeding plumage Dunlin, amazing. David Pugsley with a 2,000th of a second with the 600 and the 1.4. He loves getting down low. He's the guy that taught me the toe pod technique. And you don't see many images of a shorebird with both feet off the ground tugging on a worm. Again, 2,000th of a second might be a little overkill here for shutter speed, but in case he starts running, I'd be in good shape. Black-bellied plover. Baby oyster catcher, 2,000th of a second, 1600 ISO. Flapping. 400 2.8 alone. A miracle woodstalk. I happened to turn around. Everybody was looking at the osprey pool. Turn around, there's this beautiful woodstalk. Fix the exposure. Hand holding. Beautiful sunrise. 2,000th of a second. Woodstalk, San Diego. Again, a little, I could have shot this at 1,000th, but I'm expecting maybe...
I think that's a wood duck.
Wood duck, a Drake wood duck, yeah.
Yeah.
And the way you tell a great wood duck shot is see if you get the purple.
On the cheek.
On the cheek patch,
Okay.
Yes, sir. Because usually you don't. It's mainly in just...
So because of the color, do you need more of a shutter speed with that or no?
Well, the color has nothing to do with it. Let's see, I was 840 on a tripod, surprisingly using shutter priority. And, a 2500th would have been good if he shook his head to get the water off. But what was your original question?
Just
the color.
The color.
Yeah, the color's got nothing to do with it. The shutter speed. The compensation has to do with it because wood ducks with the dark feathers on the head, the black sort of neck patch over here, black hair, and then a very light white, ivory white on the bill. And you want to expose to the right to bring up the darker colors. So it's a challenging exposure, again, made much easier with Sony. You just go for a few zebras on the bill tip. White sky, 2500th for flight is going to work most of the time. When it's sunny, I prefer to go a little faster. Here's a cloudy one, just taken the other day with Bob in the back seat with the 200 to 600, so I'm at ISO 3200. Super sharp. And this is the big boy department for me, a Caspian Tern shooting flight off the tripod at 1200 millimeters, not something I do very often with good results. Arash hand holds the Sony 600 at 1200 millimeter for shorebirds in flight, little tiny birds. I can't do that. But this one worked. 2500th of a second at Nickerson Beach at ISO 10,000. That was on a cloudy morning. We had these big overflow tide pools. 2500th of a second at Homer. I'm full this year, but I may go back next year if I hear from somebody. But I might skip at 300.28 alone. Beautiful pink, purple, blue opposite the clear sunrise. An amazing one shooting off the blub at 1200 millimeters. Don't ask me to do it again. This is a complete miracle. And again, being not scared to push the ISO. I needed a 2500th of a second for flight, ISO 12,800. Are we lacking some fine feather detail in the blacks? Yeah, but otherwise spectacular. Here's Anita using a little too much shutter speed for my taste, but Lord, you can't argue with the image. King penguins at Volunteer Point, and she's using a 25 millimeter lens, 24 to 70 at 25 millimeters. So she was at a 2500th of a second at f2.8. She said, well, she could have used more depth of field, but no, look, the birds in the back are sharp at f2.8 because of the distance and the short focal length. Here I'm at a 3200th of a second, expecting this bird to chase after a bait fish. This was under the pier at the Soto, snowy egret. And 3200th shutter speed. They vibrate their necks, sharp-tailed grouse, when they're displaying in super low light. 3200th's great for flight. If you want to join me for the spoonbills, notice this one is with the 300.28 alone, so these birds are flying right at us. And at Santee Lakes, this is on a tripod with the 600 and the 1.4, 3200th of a second. Little wingtip blur, but razor sharp on the eye. Diving osprey, 3200th of a second. This is on the tripod. Same deal on a sunny morning, so I'm only at ISO 500. And I like you see the bait fish breaking in the water here. And 3200th of a second high ISO, incoming Brandt's cormorant. Bob, bring your 70-200 to San Diego.
Yes.
That's what we need for these puppies. Right place, right time, right exposure, 3200th of a second, 2.8. Trying out my, at the time, new 300.28. And bird behavior is repetitive. So this guy he would run, fly, walk back, and run at us again. I think Jerry was with me for this one. 3200th of a second. Then a wonderful afternoon down by the beach where they were flying and skimming at us, the young skimmers at Nickerson Beach. Another one from the bathing morning, 3200th at f4, 600 alone. And shutter priority at sunrise +2, black-bellied whistling ducks chasing each other. Homer, 3200th of a second, great for flight. And at 2.8, like both of these, you're just blurring the background beautifully. Little eagle fight, an adult and a juvie. And I love clouds, soft light, no shadows. Anita, using Nikon gear in 2019, 1000 ISO 3200. So again, a little faster than she needs, but she likes to get them super sharp. Oh, this is with the 1.4 teleconverter. Okay, 850. Hand holding the 2 to 6 at a 3200. Bob and I have been doing this every night for the past 2 weeks since we got back from Sebastian, the cranes at sunset. Another one, why 1/3200th of a second for a beautiful ruddy duck on a rock? Well, because Kevin is in a floating blind. Kevin Heiss image. In Colorado, 4,000th of a second to freeze the action, a young Stellar's jay. I think that's the mother bothering it. When it's sunny, 4,000th of a second. I even stop down from F4 to F5, so it's 2/3 of a stop. Sandwich turn at Jacksonville. 302.8 at 600 millimeters, so it's a 302.8 and the 2X. At Stickmarsh, email to join me. And the 302.8 alone, 1/4000th of a second. So now we're getting up there when it's sunny, going to the fast shutter speeds of 4,000, 4,000 cloudy, 600 alone, handheld 200 to 600, 4,000th of a second. It was a busy afternoon. I walked out to the end of the pier, the South Jetty. There were a million fishermen. I stuck my nose in. This bird caught a yellow-tailed bunker right in the only place I could have a clear shot. And bingo. Pat Fishburne is using the 302.8 and the A9 III. She's new to bird photography. She came to the house for a lesson and made this beautiful picture at a 4,000th of a second. Me at 8:40 in South Dakota, greater prairie chicken, 1/4000th of a second. 1/4000th of a second when it's sunny. 300 in the 1/4, amazing flight combination. 1/4000th. Same thing, 420, common turns, 2 of them, 1 with a fish for the chicks. And a Monty Brown image. He's another convert to Sony. This with his 302.8 and a 1/4. Beautiful shot of a fledgling common turn landing in early morning light last July. 600 alone, 1/4000th of a second. San Diego, down here at the lake, 4,000th of a second. They can move pretty violently. Blackneck stilts copulating on the tripod. 1,200 millimeters. Incoming flight on the tripod, 4,000th of a second. Another rare success with me. Wow. This is David Polikansky's, okie doke. He came with the RF 100 to 400, an inexpensive lens, and an R7, and made some amazing pictures at Homer. Want to come in 2025? You better email me so I can make a reservation. One of my eagles, 70 to 200 at 200 millimeters. Yes, that's not a typo, 200 millimeters. Stop down a stop to F4 in the sun, dorsal view, 4,000th of a second. Anita North, why a 4,000th of a second? She's in a boat. And this was in Kamloops, BC. Kevin Heiss, hand holding the 600. Beautiful coyote, I think at Yellowstone, yeah. So you got to be sharp when you're hand holding, you got to be fast. Another Kevin Heiss at a 4,000th, just love it. Mallard Drake taking flight. 5,000th of a second by Mr. Morris, just the other day. First evening we got back from Sebastian. You'd think we might take a day off or an afternoon, but down to the lake we were and had some good chances. 5,000th of a second. If you got the light shooting backlit into the bright sky at 560, if you got it, use it. Stop down 1 stop to F8. Anita with an unnamed weaver, jumping out of the nest, that 1/5000th of a second. Beautifully sharp. Me, 6400th of a second, trying to freeze the wingtips of this mountain bluebird flying back. And just two more. 8000th of a second, tree swallow coming back to the nest box. And we'll finish with a spectacular aerial shot by Anita at at shutter speed 1/8000th, flamingos in a soda lake near Nairobi, Africa. And why such a fast shutter speed? She's either in a small plane or a helicopter, hand holding a short lens, 24 to 240, never heard of that one, from Sony, and being buffeted by the wind. So I guess the main lesson is pick the shutter speed that you need to make the picture you want, whether it's slow for a blur or intermediate for a bird standing there or fast for action. Set the ISO to get a good exposure. Press the shutter button. See you out there. If you learned anything, you want to subscribe to the blog. Love you much. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We are done.